Hello, Rabbi.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, Baruch Hashem. How are you?
Very well, thank you. How did
Good.
it go? Your last
Ve-
days?
Very nice. Very
It
nice.
was a wonderful sukkah. And I love, by the way, I love sitting in sukkahs. If I had a sukkah, could I like sit in it today? Am I about Tosef or something?
Take this
If you made
off.
a bracha, you would be.
Ah.
But how long do I have to tear it down at some point, or could I keep it going all year?
No, I mean, originally they were the norm. People apparently lived in something like it. People used them in the summer to give them shade from the, from the sun. So we have Sukkot all over. So I think that it should not be a problem. The one problem would be is if you were doing it as a mitzvah, but if you're not doing it as a mitzvah,
Right. Right. Okay. 2:00 today, I have the Pidney Ben for my great nephew.
Oh, beautiful. Who's the Kohen?
I don't know him. It's a neighbor of my nephew, a friend of his and a neighbor. Yeah.
Fair enough. They are sort of fascinating experiences. It really is like a performance.
Yeah, I forgot. I went to the Goodman's grandchild's. I remember, but I don't remember. It was like,
well, there are lines. There's lines for the Kohen. There's lines for the father. It's also, I mean, obviously it depends on the custom of people doing it, but many people have accustomed to put the baby on a silver tray with jewelry.
Yes, that's what it was, brought out on a tray with jewelry all around it. And then if you have candy, are you supposed to throw it or just?
Well, I don't know. People just there's some special quality to anything that was served or anything on that tray. It's considered, I guess, like shirayim, like some kind of the mitzvah.
Okay.
So people have a thing of handing it out to others.
I see. Okay.
So Mazel Tov, everything should go well. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. You get to do that.
Well, it's not as scary as a bris, I'll tell you that much.
No, there are some I don't know, but there are some images of the moment, depending on how they're captured with the baby on a tray. You have to be.
I guess that's true.
Remind yourself of context the whole time, otherwise you get a little bit surreal. All right, so we were starting to talk about commandments where you had the death penalty and different kinds of punishments. All right, let's just go here. The manner of their count is that we count the 4 death penalties as 4 positive commandments. And the language of the Mishnah in Sanhedrin is that this is the commandment of those stoned. And likewise, do they say, and how is the commandment of those burnt? How is the commandment of those strangled? How is the commandment of those killed? And they also said that what he, may be blessed, said, you shall kindle no fire throughout your settlement, came to prohibit the punishments on Shabbat. And that which he prohibited the commandment of burning and said throughout your settlements was to say, in the settlements, that is a court, do not kindle a fire, even though the kindling is part of a positive commandment. They said burning was within a category, so why was it sing it out? Because just like burning is specified in that it is one of the 4 death penalties of the court, and does not push off the Sabbath, so too do the other death penalties of court not push off the Sabbath. All right, so again, his main focus is not whether or not something is the desire of God. In other words, he's not so much focused on whether there is such a mitzvah. He's focused on whether it is to be counted as a separate mitzvah. So how do you deal with the physical punishments? Are they to be treated as one mitzvah? Are they to be treated as several mitzvahs? And how would you determine how many mitzvahs? Because there are commandments about these and there are details about these. So how do you organize them? So he has suggested here that the death penalties would be considered 4 separate commandments, not one, but 4 separate commandments. And that if you look at the language of the Gemara, the Gemara is guiding us. That's what he is suggesting. When they use the language of this is the commandment of those that are stoned, or this is the commandment of those that are burnt, they are guiding us to this notion that they are to be treated as separate commandments, counted as separate commandments. There's also details, like for instance, that the court does not carry out these punishments on Shabbos, even though it's a positive commandment. And we do have a notion that positive commandments in certain cases can override negative commandments. But we are told that specifically, we are not supposed to execute people on Shabbos. That for some reason is important to the Torah, that we do not execute people on Shabbos. We also did see, and I think we even saw it in the Rambam, that it was important that once somebody was found guilty, that they would be executed quickly, that they wouldn't have to wait to be executed, but they would be executed quickly. So you might think, therefore, that you should execute them on Shabbos if that was after, if Shabbos is after the decision to kill the person, that you should even execute them on Shabbos. So we are told that you do not, the Rambam is saying. But even in the way that is discussed, it suggests to us that these are separate mitzvos. They're meant to be counted as mitzvos, and they are separate mitzvos. And this is clear such that no one should have a doubt about it. And likewise, it is appropriate to count lashes as a commandment. So far we have what are called the Arba Mitot Beis Din, the 4 death penalties that are carried out by the human court. And now he's adding lashes, which is a kind of physical or corporal punishment. And he's counting lashes itself as a separate commandment from the other types of punishment, until we would say, for example, that the commandment that we have been commanded to stone those that profane Shabbos is a positive commandment. The stoning of someone with an ove is he said, it is inappropriate to count every specific punishment as a separate commandment. So the fact that a person gets punished for violating Shabbos or for a kind of witchcraft, if the person gets punished for that, each one of those punishments is not considered a separate commandment. There is the prohibition itself. Let's say you're not allowed to transgress the Sabbath. That is listed. But the punishment is not listed as a separate commandment. Or let's say the punishment for idolatry. Idolatry is listed as a prohibition, but the punishment for idolatry is not listed as a separate mitzvah. there are the 4 types of execution. They are listed as a mitzvah, but the specific application in a particular case of prohibition is not to be listed as a separate commandment. And we have not seen a halachic ramification. In other words, if something's counted as one of the 613, as opposed to not counted as one of the 613, there doesn't seem to be any difference in halacha. There just seems to be a difference as far as counting. And from the beginning, I've mentioned to you that I find it somewhat surprising that the Rambam is so concerned about this. It is certainly taught in the Gemara, it's taught in the Midrash that there are 613 commandments. There are 365 negative commandments, 248 positive commandments. I know, I'm not saying that's not significant, but to the degree that he would write an entire book because he feels other people listed the other ones wrong. He's not, there may not be any halachic significance to whether they're listed or not, just a kind of organizing principle on some level that seems to be at stake here. But like, for instance, the fact that somebody listed a detail as one of his 613, as opposed to just the general category, that doesn't mean that he somehow feels that that detail should be treated halachically different than the general category. Everybody agrees how the detail should be treated. If the detail is a punishment, everybody here is agreeing that the punishment is carried out. The question is just, is it recorded as a separate mitzvah or not? To the point where the count of the commandment would be according to the classes of people that were liable for the death penalties of the court, as did someone besides us without contemplation. So there are people that for some reason did count some of these details as separate mitzvot, but he is saying that they should not be, and it was a mistake to do it. For if the matter would be like this, it would be appropriate to also perforce count each and every set of lashes on its own, to the point that the lashes for eating a carcass would be a separate commandment. The lashes for eating pork would be a second commandment. The lashes for eating of meat and milk would be a third. The lashes for wearing a forbidden mixture would be a fourth. Now, again, each one of those is considered a separate mitzvah. But the lashes that you get for each one of those, he is saying should not be counted. And for him, the positive commandment should then be according to the count of negative commandments for which we give lashes. So it would end up that every negative commandment that qualifies for lashes, the actual giving of the lashes should be a positive commandment. So you'd add by then the positive commandments would perforce be more than 400, because you'd be adding a positive commandment for every one of those negative commandments, the positive commandment to give lashes. So you don't get lashes for every negative commandment, but you do get for a lot of them. And if every one of those was a positive commandment to give the lashes, you would end up with at least 120 more 248. So you'd end up with like 150 more positive commandments than we have. But just like we do not count all those liable for lashes, but rather only count the type of punishment, that is lashes. So lashes, the notion that somebody who transgresses certain types of negative commandments would get lashes, that general notion gets one mitzvah, is counted as one mitzvah. So too do we only count the types of death penalties, and those are stoning, burning, killing, and which killing here is decapitation. It means by the sword, and strangulation. Those are the four. So it seems like the way he's getting to demonstrate that the four capital punishments are each to just be called one mitzvah, even if they get application many times, they're just called one mitzvah, to punish those who deserve it by stoning, let's say, is one mitzvah, even though there may be many cases in the Torah where somebody is to be stoned, but it still only counts as one mitzvah. It seems like the way he gets to that is through lashes. He can demonstrate that it's not possible that lashes are meant to be counted separately every time they're implemented. So since that's the case, it doesn't make sense that every time somebody's to be stoned, that would be counted as a separate mitzvah.
The punishments, according to the Rambam, they're positive commandments. That to administer lashes is a positive commandment.
Correct.
To administer, but it's always important, I think, to distinguish between absolute positive commandments and conditional. We talked about the distinction, like, with a get. It's not a great mitzvah to divorce your wife, but if you do so, and this is in the cases of, you don't go out of your way in order to strangle somebody in order to make sure that you fulfilled their commandment.
Correct. And it is the confusing reality that the same word is used both in Hebrew and often in English. And you're right. It is like, for instance, we go out of our way. In fact, I was even working on this with a young man at one point to come up with a kind of, how birders have bird books where they will record where and when they saw a particular bird and maybe some comments about it. And their goal is to see as many interesting birds as possible and to record as many as they can. So I thought it would be interesting to have like a mitzvah book like that, like for kids, where they would have a book where they could record that they did a particular mitzvah and where and when they did it, sort of like a birding book. But one of the funny things we found, trying to do it right away, is there aren't that many mitzvahs that, and this would be positive mitzvahs you would do it for, as opposed to negative mitzvahs. There aren't that many mitzvahs that you would go out of your way to do in that way. I think we came up with only like 50 something that you'd actually end up going out of your way to do if you did according to the Rambam's count. Again, you could revisit and just decide that you're not just going to include the ones that officially count, but you're doing all sorts of mitzvahs, even the ones that don't officially count as part of the 613. But if you're just doing the list of 613 and you're doing the ones that you want to go out of your way to do, the number was like in the 50s, because as you point out, there's a lot of conditional mitzvahs that are not something you want to go out of your way to do. And these would be amongst them. Like you don't hear about, like you do hear, one of the surprising ones that you do hear people going out of their way for, even though it sounds like a conditional mitzvah, is shooing away the mother bird. Shooing away the mother bird sounds like a mitzvah you would only do if you were in that circumstance. If you find yourself in a circumstance and you need eggs or you need the chicks, then the way to do it is to shoo away the mother bird. It sounds sort of like what you were calling conditional mitzvahs, but it's not treated that way. People actually go out of their way to do this mitzvah. And I think you mentioned that Rabbi Francis, I think, has the egg. He actually kept the egg, I think, from when he shooed away the mother bird. Either you mentioned it or I mentioned, or somebody else told me that he did it and he kept the egg. I think I may have heard him say it too. But I did it. I did not keep the egg. I lifted the egg and then I put the egg back. But But there are people that go out of their way to do that mitzvah, even though it does sound like it would be one of the conditional ones. You do not hear about or read about a sage that, let's say there was a death penalty and it was a rare thing in their time. Do you hear about a sage saying, I would like to be the one to stone the person, or I'd like to be the one to cut his head off?
No.
because it would be a schus to actually do this mitzvah, and a rare opportunity. Like you hear that in Chicago, they had a Pidyon Peter Chamor, where they actually invited people and they did it as, as a kind of an assembly of people, and they did the mitzvah as a big public gesture, where they redeemed a donkey with a sheep, and they made, and it's a rare, and they advertised it as a rare mitzvah, and this is your opportunity to come and, to engage in this rare mitzvah. That also sounds sort of like a conditional one. So there are some outliers, some surprises, but you're right, like the mitzvah of get, the mitzvah to do a divorce. This is a kind of instruction of how to behave when these circumstances present themselves, but it's not something you're going out of your way to want to do, as if it's some kind of special merit that every husband and wife should go through a divorce, should aspire to go through a divorce. You hear about people that get divorced and then they get married again, right after, just so they could fulfill the mitzvah of divorce. You don't hear of it, that it's somehow a special merit. So that is a distinction, and there are learned commentaries that make that distinction in certain places.
This thing cuts pretty deep, because there's a mitzvah to take care of the poor. It's an obligation. Now, you can only fulfill the obligation if there are poor. So it seems that you have a vested interest in making sure that there's a abundant supply of poor people.
We recently saw, I don't know where I saw this, but I recently saw that there was it was either a Gemara or a Medrash that said, oh, I know it, because we were learning Bahar. I think it was Lois, was our Thursday class when we were learning the part of Bahar that talked about the poor. And we actually saw that, I think it was a Medrash that said that this is a kind of promise that there will always be poor. It sounded like there will even be poor. And the Rambam's language sort of fits this, where the Rambam said the only difference between the times of Mashiach and now is Shibud Malchias, the fact that the Gentile nations control our destiny. But otherwise, things will continue as they are, which would, and it seemed to be that Medrash was in keeping with this notion. I think it's Shmuel who's the one who says it in the Gemara, but the Rambam codifies it. And that Medrash seemed to suggest there will always be poor people. That's part of the fact that the Torah talks about taking care of your brother when he falls on hard times, or the various mitzvahs of tzedakah that are over there in that Torah portion, means that there will always be people in these situations.
I wonder if you could transfer that to someone who's poor in spirit or poor in another. Well, I don't know.
By the way, am I muted?
No, talk.
I remember Rabbi Francis said that that's one of the reasons that we don't make a bracha on tzedakah. Because
what did he say specifically?
Pardon me?
What did he say was one of the reasons?
Because that it requires poor people, that the fulfillment of the mitzvah depends upon that. That's one of the reasons that we don't make a bracha on tzedakah. Not only the uncertainty whether it's going to work there, but this was a different
Yeah.
sort of reason. I remember he said that.
Something like
Interesting. Also, by the way, I mean, even within tzedakah, there's different types of tzedakah. Like sometimes you're just providing something that somebody doesn't have and can't get access to, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily suffering as poor. So for instance, like they may not feel deprivation. It's just that something may come up and they can't afford it. So their general condition is not deprivation, but something's come up that they can't afford. And that could even you have what we call gemachs. Like some guy, let's say, has a tool gemach. So he bought all these expensive power tools, and then he lends them out to people who don't have the power tools. Now, that is technically called tzedakah, what he's doing, and he can use tzedakah funds for it. I know there's, when it actually boils down to the specific decision in the moment, there are considerations about what qualifies, but in general, that does qualify. Or people that, let's say, have chairs, they have folding chairs for simchas. So they bought, let's say, 100 folding chairs and they store them. And then if somebody has a simcha, they can go and borrow those chairs from the gemach. Now, tzedakah money was used for it. And in principle, what the person's doing is tzedakah because they're providing something for people who don't have it. Now, I've borrowed from those kind of gemachs. I don't feel like I'm living a life of privation, but I found myself benefiting from something that is called a tzedakah or a chesed. I mean, this person's using the reason I feel like it's also tzedakah is because the person can use tzedakah money in order to buy those chairs. Now, it could be there's hierarchy, like if I have somebody standing in front of me who doesn't have food or shelter, or I could buy chairs to lend to people. Somebody might say, obviously, the hierarchy, the money should go to the person who needs food and shelter, but it's still considered in that category. So there could be, I'm just thinking, there could be all sorts of circumstances of tzedakah, even in a time of plenty, a relative plenty. So there still would be some haves and have-nots, but even the have-nots would not be living the life of privation that they do in third world countries today, or that they've had in in previous times in history.
Right. The reason I mentioned, because excuse me, it seems so wrong in a time of Mashiach to have that kind of poverty. It just it doesn't register with me.
Even the Rambam says, I think one time we're going to learn that Rambam, the Sefer Malachim, the Book of Kings, because I think it has a lot of that general stuff in it. We have covered a little bit of it in some of the other works we had, but he does say that in a time where there's not war, it allows people to focus on the relief of poverty and healing. In other words, a lot of what might be considered natural circumstances could get attention. And it could even be argued. I know there are people that argue this nowadays, that in much of the world, this has happened. In other words, again, we're not talking about, like, apparently Somalia is once again on the verge of complete collapse and the terrible starvation and stuff. But in much of the other parts of the world, there has been attention and diversion of resources to the point where the have-nots are living differently than they used to. There's still privation, but not the degree of privation that there once was. So yeah, so I think we could say that it's a matter of degree, and it's just a question of some people having more and some people having less, but that even the people that have less have a basic degree. Like, I mean, I think I've once shared with you that I had this homeless friend when I was teaching at Or Sameach. I met him because when I started teaching there, he would come. Or Sameach had a deal that if you came to a class, you could stay for lunch. So he would come for I met him because he would come to my class and then he would stay for lunch. And so I got to know him, and I found out that he was on and off homeless. So we stayed in touch for several years. And at one point, they opened a homeless shelter in the old city. I think they called it Ashel Avraham. Some organization opened a homeless shelter in the old city. It only lasted for a few months and then it closed. And I got so frustrated because he was living in that homeless shelter, and then suddenly he had didn't have a place to live. And so I called Bituach Leumi, which is Israel's Social Security kind of place. And I spoke to some lady and I said, I know this guy, he's homeless. And I just don't understand, because he was staying at this shelter and now this shelter is closed. And my understanding is there is no other shelter. How could we be living in a time in Jerusalem where there's no shelter for the homeless, where there's no place for the homeless to be? And I finished with my rant, and she goes, "Are you finished?" I said, "Yes." And she goes, "The reason there are not homeless shelters is because we find these people apartments. What is his name?" And I told her his name. And so, and then she said, "Have him call me at this number." He called her and he got an apartment. He got an apartment. He got healthcare. He just didn't know how to do it. And I didn't know how to do it. But in Israel, that was the goal in Israel, that there would be nobody without an apartment and without healthcare and without basic food. And then once he got hooked up into the system, it really did change his life. So again, there's people who fall through the cracks of this, but it could be argued that there is something like that going on in some places, that there has been a change. But still, he's still poor in the sense that his life choices are limited because he has limited income, and he doesn't have access to the same benefits that my life had access to. So he's still, you would say, needy and poor, but he didn't have to live on the street, and he's going to have food and he's going to have health care. So yeah, so I agree with you. I think that and there may be levels and levels and levels of that as things go up. Maybe what it just means is that there's always going to be haves, relative haves and have-nots.
I wonder if it could be chelek v'chelko. In other words, those, I don't know. Yeah, well, simcha v'chelko. Even though some need more, some need less in time of Mashiach. Who knows? I don't know. It's
and it could be even if I feel like I am a person who is one of the people who have, which I typically do feel that way, there may be certain elements in my life where I need the help of somebody else. And maybe that's always beneficial too, that even if I'm mostly what I think of as self-sufficient, I mean, I don't think it's healthy for us to think we're entirely self-sufficient, but if I'm thinking I'm mostly self-sufficient, it still might be healthy also for me to recognize that there are certain areas where I do need somebody else because I can't do it. I don't know how to do it, or I don't have the means to do it, and I need somebody else to step in. And I know that there are people where it's a very hard thing because much of their life they've thought of themselves as net givers, and then to have to receive is a very hard thing. But there's also a very profound lesson in that, even for the person that's receiving. So maybe there could be a system where, for the most part, we have what we need, but there's always some things we don't, because and that need to be provided by somebody else. Kol Yisrael are raving that all of Israel are sort of guarantors for each other, and there's going to be some area where I'm going to need somebody else to give, and so and when you deal with that on a large scale, that means there's always going to be the need for the tzedakah, even though the particular person that is receiving here doesn't have to receive always, but they have to receive now. Maybe something like that. All righty. Okay. So thank you for being here and for being part of this. And I look forward to getting back to our relatively normal schedule and to be learning again on Monday. And then tomorrow, I'm planning on doing our Thursday.
One quick
Right.
coda.
Yeah.
I had a
Thank you,
friend.
Rabbi. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I had a friend who was a Gentile. His name was Richard Galuska. He's passed away. He was a very bright guy and a very firm guy. He was a Christian, but he was firm. And he said the problem with getting, whenever you get more, you need more. It's it's sort of like a state of mind or something. But whenever you think that, this would be satisfactory, you immediately realize that it's not satisfactory. And it seems to be a universal phenomenon.
Right.
So there's.
But you could, I mean, I know that they talk about like diminishing returns, that there are certain needs that are so basic, maybe like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like the lowest ones, like food and shelter and security. So there may be there might be a certain threshold where you've reached some level of achievement, and then there's diminishing returns. But I mean, even I think I once read the Dalai Lama was once making this point, because when he started to interact with people from Western countries, it was a bit of a shock to him, because he's suddenly around entire societies where they have so much. And he did say that after a while he learned that even these societies that have a lot, there are obviously people still have trouble, and like you said, they still feel like they need more, etc. But there just seems to be this point where we could agree that you need to get past this threshold. Once you're past this threshold, then it's okay to be sort of self-sufficient and not to ask for more. But until you get to that threshold, you really need to ask for more. If your children are not getting basic nutrition, or not getting basic health care, or and not getting what we would consider basic necessary education, so it would be wrong for you to turn down the help. But let's say they're getting all that, but maybe they'd have to go to community college. They can't go to Harvard. Maybe there would be agreement that now you could now you could, turn it down. So, but there still might be areas where where somebody would look at you and they say, you must take. Somebody's ill, and the only way for them to get healed is because they're going to have to take. This is not something somebody can afford or whatever. This is something you're going to have to take in order to get it, and that there would be wrong to turn it down. Something like that.
I understand. I mean, it's mostly that it's not so much greed, but it's just being not worried about losing it. But it seems the more you have, and the Talmud tell you, the more you have, the more riches, the more worries, right? The more you have, the harder you have to try to protect it. But it's always a higher and a higher number that you feel comfortable with.
Right. So you would work on the techniques and the qualities that allow you to manage that, the worry and the stuff. Like you'd practice doing with less, even if you could have more, but you'd practice having less, and you would work on your attitude towards what it is that you have. And
Yes.
It's hard to work on those attitudes.
No, but we do.
When I worry about something, like if I worry intensely, I don't worry, but it's not long. I worry for a week, 2 weeks.
Yeah, but we do have practices that are designed, to work on that. And these are practices that are, I'm even in Pirkei Avos and places like that, they are mentoring for people to try to deal with that, so that we can live without needing more,
Yes.
to try to deal with that.
Be the phone.
Thank you.
All right. Be well.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.